Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Friday, November 3rd, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, the House passes a $14.3 billion bill for Israel. So the House on Thursday passed a bill to provide Israel with $14.3 billion in military aid, a strong show of support for Israel's onslaught on Gaza, which has killed over 9,000 people so far. The Republican-authored bill would cut funds from the Internal Revenue Service to pay for Israel's aid, and this has drawn opposition from Democrats. So the bill passed in a vote of 226 to 196. Only 12 Democrats voted in favor, and it didn't get all that opposition from Democrats because they oppose sending new weapons to Israel. It's because they don't want to cut from the IRS. Two Republicans voted against the bill. Thomas Massie, who's been voting against all this Israel stuff, and you know he's been really good on this issue. Marjorie Taylor Greene also voted against it. Due to the IRS cuts that are included in the bill, the White House has threatened to veto it, and the Democrat-controlled Senate is working on its own version. So Democrats expressed frustration at the GOP bill, saying it will only delay getting more weapons to Israel, which already receives $3.8 billion in military aid from the U.S. each year. And when this thing first, after the October 7th Hamas attack on southern Israel, the U.S. started shipping additional military aid to Israel using some other funds that they had available. So Chuck Schumer said that the Senate would not take up the House version of the bill at all and would introduce its own version that will include funding for the Ukraine war and humanitarian aid for Gaza. The White House recently requested that massive $105 billion spending package, and that included military aid for Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan, also border security spending. So it's not clear if the Senate is going to include all that. They're saying Israel and Ukraine, so I'm not sure if that means just Israel and Ukraine and humanitarian aid, or if they're going to roll in some of the other stuff too, like Taiwan. So House Speaker Mike Johnson, he's the new House Speaker, Republican from Florida, and right after he was elected, he vowed to prioritize helping Israel. That was his big priority. So this was his work. And he said that the GOP version of the bill helps Israel in its bombardment of Gaza while also working to ensure responsible spending. I mean, that's just such typical Republican line. They're cutting some spending from the IRS, and instead of just cutting it, they have to use it to fund a foreign war. And, responsible spending, saying that this is responsible spending when you see what Israel's doing in Gaza, just slaughtering people by the thousands, children by the thousands, sending them more weapons, risking a wider regional war when American troops are under attack in Syria and Iraq, is not responsible at all. But explaining his opposition to the bill, Rep. Massie said that the U.S. could not afford it. He wrote on X, quote, "Soaring inflation and high interest rates are due to overspending. We can't afford more foreign aid. I voted against the billions for Ukraine, and I am voting against 14 plus billion of foreign aid for Israel tonight," end quote. So he said that before the vote. But he's really standing up to the, AIPAC and everything. So it's good to see. All right. So the next one here, Representative Mast says that there are no innocent Palestinian civilians. So this is Brian Mast. He's a Republican from Florida and a former member of the Israeli Defense Forces. He's a former IDF soldier. And he has dismissed the idea that there are innocent Palestinian civilians, and he made these comments in a debate on the House floor on Wednesday. So he said, quote, "I would encourage the other side to not so lightly throw around the idea of innocent Palestinian civilians as frequently said. I don't think we would so lightly throw around the term innocent Nazi civilians during World War II, end quote. So again, invoking World War II, invoking the mass slaughter of German and Japanese civilians to justify the mass slaughter of Palestinian civilians. We're seeing this pretty commonly now from U.S. and Israeli officials. So Mast actually recently wore his IDF uniform on Capitol Hill, which just demonstrates, I mean, could you imagine a member of Congress wearing a military uniform of any other foreign country? I mean, it would be an outrage. And he showed up on Capitol Hill with his uniform on. I mean, it's just unbelievable. So he made the comments about Palestinian civilians while the House was debating the Hamas International Financing Prevention Act, which is a bill that requires sanctions on alleged Hamas supporters. The bill requires presidential waivers to deliver humanitarian aid into Gaza and the West Bank, and that will slow down the delivery of food, medicine, and other supplies to civilians. If every delivery needs a waiver, that would really slow things down. And the original version of the bill actually included a blanket exemption for humanitarian aid, but Mast added an amendment to require the waivers. And, you know, this wouldn't just disrupt U.S. aid shipments into Gaza. This means sanctions. This means they're sanctioning anybody that they accuse of supporting Hamas. So if a company or, you know, is contracted to deliver aid into Gaza and then they see they have to get this waiver, you know, a lot of them just won't even bother. That's a lot of times the cause of shortages and stuff from sanctions is that there are technically waivers and exemptions, but the companies just don't want to bother doing business when they have to worry about it. So anyway, Mast added this amendment to require the waivers. And when he did that last month at a House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing, he made similar comments. So he said, quote, "Any assistance should be slowed down, any assistance, because I would challenge anybody in here to point to me which Palestinian is Hamas and which one is an innocent civilian. Which is the child that was poking other Israeli children," end quote. According to, I got this quote from The Intercept, and they said that Mast was referring to a video that purportedly shows a Palestinian child poking an Israeli hostage. I've never, I never saw that video. I don't know if it's what it is, if it's real or not. But he's saying even the children aren't innocent. I mean, that's what he's saying here. So he went on, quote, "And which ones exactly are the innocent ones? It should absolutely be every effort made to slow down any perceived assistance that's going there," end quote. So he seems to be in favor not only of the bombing campaign to kill civilians, but also the siege to starve them out. So this bill passed the House, of course, in a vote of 363 to 46. 45 progressive Democrats voted no, and one Republican opposed the bill, and that was Thomas Massie. He's getting mentioned a few times in these stories tonight. So the next one here, the House passes a resolution that suggests using force against Iran. So a lot of stuff about Congress here. The House, this was on Wednesday, they passed a resolution that suggested the U.S. would use force against Iran in the future in the name of preventing the country from acquiring nuclear weapons. The resolution says that a nuclear-armed Iran is unacceptable and declares that it's the policy of the U.S. to use all means necessary to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. So there was recently a U.S. intelligence report that affirmed Iran is not pursuing nuclear weapons. They're not trying to make a nuclear bomb. The Pentagon said that in their nuclear strategy that they released last year. But that doesn't stop the Iran hawks in the U.S. and in Israel from constantly hyping up this threat of Iran's nuclear program, which is a civilian nuclear program. And at the same time, these officials and the governments of the U.S. and Israel do not recognize, formally acknowledge that Israel has nukes, has a secret nuclear weapons program that exists and is not subject to any oversight, and they just pretend it doesn't exist and make all these claims about Iran's nuclear program. So this resolution passed in a vote of 354 to 53, so a pretty similar vote as the other one, and 50 Democrats, and there was 3 Republicans that voted against the measure. Massey was one of them, and I put in a quote from him. He says, quote, "Yesterday, Congress passed a resolution that claims Iran possesses all it needs for a nuclear weapon. The same resolution says the U.S. should use all means necessary to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. Seems like a call for war on Iran. I voted no," end quote. So he mentioned that the resolution says that Iran has what it needs to make a nuclear weapon, and the resolution points to Iran, the fact that they're enriching uranium at a 60% level. That is still lower than the 90% level that is needed for weapons-grade uranium. They point to Iran's stockpile of 60% enriched uranium and at lower levels at 20% as evidence of this. But again, if it's not 90%, then they can't make a bomb with it. And there's no indication that Iran is looking to take that step to enrich 90%. And the reason why they're enriching at 60% is they did that in response to an Israeli covert attack on one of their nuclear facilities that happened when they started negotiations with the U.S. So Israel tried to sabotage the negotiations. It led to Iran increasing its enrichment. And of course, if the nuclear deal still existed, the Iran nuclear deal, known as the JCPOA, limited Iran's nuclear enrichment, uranium enrichment, at 3.67%. So very low. But these Iran hawks, they don't want to restore the nuclear deal, but they're always going on about their uranium enrichment levels. But if that's what they really cared about, there was this perfectly good deal that kept it at a very low level. All right, the next one here, Durbin becomes the first U.S. senator to call for a Gaza ceasefire. So 27 days into Israel's brutal bombing campaign, Senator Dick Durbin, Democrat from Illinois, became the first member of the U.S. Senate to call for a ceasefire. So he was asked in an interview on CNN if it's time to call for one, and he says that he thinks it is. He said, quote, "At least in the context of both sides agreeing. For example, the release of those kidnapped should be part of this. Immediate release, that should be the beginning of it. An effort should be made to engage in conversation between the Israelis and Palestinians," end quote. So Durbin, he's not some progressive Democrat. He's actually the Senate Majority Whip, so that makes him the second highest level Democrat in the Senate. I saw a write-up about this from Ryan Grimm at The Intercept, and apparently Durbin, back in the 80s, when he first ran for Congress for the House, he was one of AIPAC's first candidates that was selected by the Israel lobby. And so, it's significant to see him saying this, although he's saying the release of hostages. Does that mean ceasefire, get the hostages, and go back to war? But at least he's using the word ceasefire that Biden refuses to use. He was confronted by a protester asking him on Wednesday, "Why don't you call for a ceasefire?" And Biden said, "Oh, we should have a pause to get the prisoners out." And we'll get more into that in the next story. But I had the numbers in here just from the death toll, and the Gaza's health ministry said that it surpassed 9,000 on Thursday, and the total includes 3,760 children. All right, so the next one here, Blinken heads to Israel to discuss the Gaza war. So Secretary of State Antony Blinken is headed to Israel to meet with Netanyahu to discuss the war in Gaza and what will come after if Israel is successful in rooting out Hamas. So U.S. officials told Axios that Blinken will discuss the idea of temporary pauses in Israel's operations to facilitate aid deliveries and potentially more hostage releases. The Biden administration is carefully avoiding the word ceasefire as it's determined to continue supporting the war. So they're just making it very clear that we're not saying you should stop the war. We're just saying maybe stop for a little while, try to get some hostages out, then you could go back to killing. So Israel's Khan News actually reported that Netanyahu is considering U.S. requests for a temporary pause, temporary ceasefire. They actually did use the word ceasefire in that report. But at this point, nothing is really confirmed. Publicly, Israeli officials have said there will be no ceasefire of any kind. The fighting on the ground is continuing. Israel's saying they're advancing, closing in on Gaza City. They're trying to cut it off from the rest of Gaza, so they're trying to really encircle it. So before leaving for Israel on Thursday, Blinken told reporters that he will focus on steps that need to be taken to protect civilians who he said are in a crossfire of Hamas's making. So, of course, always blaming Hamas, even though Israel is just leveling entire neighborhoods. But, there's no real sign that the U.S. is pressuring Israel to change its indiscriminate tactics. Earlier this week, as I've covered a lot, the Pentagon was asked about the civilian casualties, about the child casualties, and they said there's no limits on how they use the weapons that the U.S. gives them. And Blinken also stressed that he will focus on discussions about a post-war Gaza. He said, quote, "We're focused on the day of. We also need to be focused on the day after. So in conversations that we'll be having through the course of this weekend, I expect you'll see a focus there, and particularly how we can get over time to 2 states for 2 peoples," end quote. But if you look at, we know the Israeli government is thinking they want to push all the Palestinians out of Gaza, cleanse them. They can't do it now because Egypt is very strongly opposed to it. But they're not thinking about a 2-state solution. I mean, that's a fantasy, especially if you look at the West Bank. Almost 1,000 Palestinians have been displaced since October 7th, over 100 killed by settlers. They're taking every opportunity they can to, kick the Palestinians out of their homes in the West Bank, telling them to go to Jordan or they're going to be killed. All right, so the next one here, Gaza authorities say 15 killed in a strike on another refugee camp. This is the Bureij refugee camp. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. But Gazan authorities say that 15 people have been killed in an Israeli airstrike on the Bureij refugee camp, marking the 3rd bombing of a camp in as many days. A spokesperson for Gaza Civil Defense said the strike on Thursday in central Gaza hit a residential building, and residents reported scores of people trapped beneath the rubble. So just another massacre, it looks like, and you could see some of the pictures here, just completely destroyed. And this was strikes on Thursday. And again, with the fighting, I didn't have anything about the fighting on the ground. Hamas is saying that they're inflicting a lot of casualties on the Israelis. The Israelis say they're advancing. They say the death toll of Israeli soldiers is up to 18 now. So we'll see. All right, so the next one here, Lebanon-Israel border fighting picks up before Hezbollah leader's speech. So Hezbollah attacked 19 Israeli positions simultaneously along the border, prompting a retaliatory assault from Israel a day before an anticipated speech by the group's leader, Hassan Nasrallah. So this is kind of a big deal. They announced that Nasrallah was giving this speech earlier in the week, and the flare-ups on the Israel-Lebanon border continue. Israel's really been doing a lot of damage in Lebanon. Dozens of people have been killed, thousands displaced. Israel also evacuated a lot of people from northern Israel. So the strikes that happened on Thursday, they said that they targeted the military positions along the border simultaneously with guided missiles, artillery shelling, and other weapons. So some people think that Nasrallah is going to come out on Friday and basically declare war against Israel and call for a full mobilization. And the attacks and fighting has been escalating across the border. So we will see what happens. And then, of course, the thing, the big question is the U.S. going to directly intervene if Hezbollah directly intervenes? So we'll see what he says in his speech on Friday. All right, so the next one here, Ukraine's commander-in-chief says the war is a stalemate. Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief General Valery Zaluzhny acknowledged in comments to The Economist that the war in Ukraine is a stalemate and that there will most likely be no Ukrainian breakthrough. The general said, quote, "Just like in the First World War, we have reached the level of technology that put us in a stalemate. There will most likely be no deep and beautiful breakthrough," end quote. So Ukraine gained no significant territory in its counteroffensive that was launched back in June. And we know, leading up to the counteroffensive, there was media reports and then also the Discord leaks saying that the U.S. did not think Ukraine would have much success But the Biden administration pushed for this thing anyway, rejecting the idea of a ceasefire. Zaluzhny discussed changes he tried to make during the counteroffensive. He said, quote, "First, I thought there was something wrong with our commanders, so I changed some of them. Then I thought maybe our soldiers are not fit for purpose, so I moved soldiers in some brigades," end quote. So after the changes failed, Zaluzhny said he looked to a book published in 1941 by a Soviet major general that analyzed World War I. So again, this is World War I he's talking about. He said, quote, "And before I got even halfway through it, I realized that is exactly where we are, because just like then, the level of our technological development today has put both us and our enemies in a stupor," end quote. So Zaluzhny said that both sides can always see that the other is coming thanks to modern technology and thanks to intelligence that Ukraine gets from the U.S. He said, quote, "The simple fact is that we see everything the enemy is doing and they see everything we are doing. In order for us to break this deadlock, we need something new, like the gunpowder which the Chinese invented and which we are still using to kill each other," end quote. So despite his assessment, the Economist report said Zaluzhny believes the fighting should continue. The report said, quote, "Nevertheless, he insists that Ukraine has no choice but to keep the initiative by remaining on the offensive, even if it only moves by a few meters a day," end quote. So this interview with Zaluzhny was published not long after that Time magazine report that I covered earlier this week that quoted Zelensky's aides and advisors saying that he's basically delusional, thinking that Ukraine can win, saying that they're out of options, that they're not winning, but Zelensky's just not accepting that, and that peace talks are still basically forbidden, talks with Russia. So it's just another sign. And again, despite all this reality being very clear now, Biden's still looking for $61 billion to fund this war for another year. It goes to show it's not about a Ukrainian victory. They know that that's not going to happen. It's just about keeping this war going. They just want to fuel it. They think they're hurting Russia. They want more Russians to be killed. They don't care about Ukrainians being killed, because there is still very heavy fighting, even though it's a stalemate. A lot of people are dying, and they just don't care. Or maybe that's exactly what Biden and them want. All right, so the next one here, Russia revokes the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. So Russian President Vladimir Putin on Thursday signed a bill into law that formally withdrew Russia's ratification of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the CTBT, which prohibits all nuclear weapons tests, but it has not been ratified. So Russia withdrew its ratification. This treaty has not been ratified by many nuclear powers, including the U.S., so when Putin announced that he was doing this, he said it would be done to mirror U.S. policy. The U.S. and Russia are still participants in the 1963 Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which prohibits all nuclear weapons tests except those performed underground. So it's not clear if Russia plans on starting testing nuclear weapons. Russian officials have said that if the U.S. conducts full-scale nuclear weapons tests, Moscow will have to reciprocate. And the U.S. did just conduct an explosion at a nuclear test site in Nevada. Russia said they thought it was a message to them because it happened after they said they were going to de-ratify this treaty. So it's just another sign that, where we are in the state of arms control between the U.S. and Russia, and just general dialogue. There's just no talks about arms control or anything between them. All right, so the next one here actually is kind of some good news and is related. China and the U.S. are scheduled to hold nuclear non-proliferation talks for the first time in years. So China and the United States will discuss arms control and nuclear non-proliferation next week in the first talks of their kind in over 4 years. So the Chinese delegation will be led by Sung Xiaobo, who leads the Foreign Ministry's Arms Control Department. Wang Wenbin, a spokesman for the ministry, told a news conference on Thursday. So the U.S. will be represented by Mallory Stewart, the Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control, Verification, and Compliance. according to the Wall Street Journal. So I think, again, this is good to see. The last time they held such talks was in July 2019. For a while there, the U.S. was trying to get China to join in on arms control talks with Russia, like trilateral arms control talks, nuclear arms control talks. But when it comes to Russia and China, that's just not enticing to China at all, because their nuclear arsenal is much smaller than what the U.S. and Russia have. The U.S. and Russia both have around 6,000 nukes. The U.S. slightly less than 6,000, and Russia has just slightly more. And China, according to the current estimates, has 300, 400. The U.S. is claiming they have 500, I think, now. But still nothing close to what the U.S. and Russia have. So that offer was always a non-starter. But the U.S. and China could theoretically work out some kind of deal on deployments, prohibiting deployments in, Southeast Asia, or in the Asia Pacific. There are things that the U.S. and China could work out on their own. But I'm pretty pessimistic about the state of U.S.-China relations, but still, I think it's good to see arms control talks. But the next one here is not so good news when it comes to China. So Biden nominates a China hawk as the State Department number 2, a very important, influential China hawk. This article is from AFP. So President Joe Biden on Wednesday nominated Kurt Campbell, the hard-charging architect of the U.S. pivot to Asia, to face a rising China as the State Department's number 2, a sign of priorities despite Middle East turmoil. So Campbell, who since Biden took office has coordinated Asia policy at the White House, will need confirmation from the Senate, where his Democratic Party holds a slender majority. A well-known presence on Washington's think tank circuit, Campbell took an unusually high profile under former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton as the top diplomat for Asia, pursuing a punishing trans-Pacific travel schedule as he made the case that the United States was in Asia for the long haul. So again, the architect of the pivot to Asia, which started under Obama, which is this policy of building up militarily, building up alliances, sending more ships and planes to the South China Sea, challenging China's claims. He oversaw the beginning of that under Obama, which all ramped up during Trump and continues to ramp up under Biden. And I know Campbell has said some very, hawkish things about China. He said the era of engagement with China is over. Now it's the era of, competition and confrontation. So, China is, still the Pentagon and all the other U.S. government agencies say China's, the big threat, with Russia coming in second. So even amid, this war in Ukraine, this war in Gaza, they're still preparing for, a future war with China. And the scary thing about that is that they're planning to take on China directly. And, even though they have nuclear weapons, it doesn't seem to be taken into account in any of the war games that the think tanks do when they're talking about, a battle between the U.S. and China over Taiwan. All right, that's it for the news. That was a lot of stuff today. Go check out our viewpoints. We have one from Jonathan Cook. Mounting evidence suggests Israel may be ready to cleanse Gaza. One from Ted Snyder. Volodymyr Zelensky is in a sea of troubles. One from Joseph Solis Mullen. GOP solutions would destabilize Central America, not fix it. One from Judge Knapp. Guantanamo, a constitutional debacle. And our spotlight is from Amira Haas. Amid mourning, Israel's settlement enterprises celebrates a great victory. Also, again, today was a really busy day, and there's a lot of stories I couldn't fit up top. But if you scroll down, there's just a ton of stuff that we have in the lower section about Gaza and the situation there, and just a lot going on. You could always go check out our blog. We repost the Ron Paul Liberty Report. Also, Kyle Anzalone's show, Conflicts of Interest. So lots of stuff that you can go check out, even if you listen to this show. But that's it for me for the week. I hope everybody has a good weekend. Again, I'll be on Timcast on Friday night. They stream from 8 p.m. Eastern time to 10 p.m. So check that out. If you want, we'll see how it goes. I'll be back after the weekend. Again, I appreciate everybody that listens, comments, and shares, and all that stuff. It's a big help. But I'll talk to you in a couple days. Thanks for listening.